With so many amazing choices available for buying colored cardstock, why would you ever want to make your own? Maybe you only need a small amount of a specific color. Maybe you don't want to have to figure out how or where to store multiple packs of colored cardstock. Maybe you want a custom color that matches other elements on your card. But the best reason of all? It's fun. Let's get started. I have 6 quick techniques to show you, so you know it's going to be a rainbow. And I'm starting with pink, ink blending, and stamping. Some people find ink blending challenging, so let me give you 6 quick tips for success. Number 1, start with smooth paper. I'm using Neenah, but many people prefer Bristol Smooth for its ultra smooth texture, which makes ink blending easier. Number 2, use a juicy ink pad. The key here is to use lots of ink. Number 3, use a blending tool that works for the look you want. I'm using an Altenew large blending brush, and you can see that it quickly covers a large area with no harsh marks, but it gives a fairly soft look until you layer it up quite a bit. So if you want quick, heavy coverage, I recommend domed sponge blenders. Number 4, start off the panel and blend onto it. This helps avoid harsh lines or marks from your tool. Number 5, layer it up. The more ink on the paper, the smoother your blend will be. Number 6, if you're blending more than one color, you can use intermediate colors to help transition between them. On one side of this panel, I moved from a pink to a bright fuchsia ink to deepen up the color there. On the other side, I went to a redder pink, so the transition between the 3 colors is very subtle, but this tip really helps if you're trying to blend colors that are further apart on the color wheel. Number 7, walk away and let it dry. I'm using Catherine Pooler inks, and I find that they smooth out even more as they dry. I lightly spritzed my panel with water for some texture, but I wanted to add even more texture, so I used a background stamp from Hero Arts. I put my panel in the center of my MISTI so I can get full coverage from the stamp. This stamp has very closely spaced, irregular stripes, and it'll give my panel an almost wood grain look. I stamped it with the original pink color, and that will make the variations from the blending even more subtle. Moving on to orange, I'm going direct to paper. All that means is I'm swiping the ink pad right onto my white panel to get maximum coverage. You can also press the ink pad down as I'm doing now, whichever technique you prefer. And again, the initial look isn't completely even, but as it dries, it smooths out, and now I'm going in with another layer of a darker color. This time I'm using a mini ink pad, and I'm using it like a stamp by pressing it randomly over the panel. This step is optional, but it does give some texture and a tone-on-tone look. I spritzed this one with shimmer spray for some sparkle. Next is yellow, and I'm changing from an ink pad to a selection of yellow Copic markers. I'm simply coloring stripes down the panel, moving randomly between my 5 markers and trying to keep it as straight as I can. There are so many looks you can get with this method, and a while ago I shared a video showing 7 different ways to use Copic markers to create a background. Moving on to green and yet another medium, this time I'm using Wow Embossing Glitter in Lime Rickey. I start by pressing my embossing ink onto my panel, making sure to get very good coverage. Then I sprinkle the powder all over, shake off the excess, and melt it in my foil-lined shoebox lid. This lid means I'm not trying to hold on to the edges of the panel while I'm trying to heat it up. I'll be honest, when I was done, I was not happy with the results. This powder is quite translucent, and while the panel is pretty, it didn't have the real punch of lime color that I was hoping for. I could have started over with a green inked panel, but I decided to just try giving it another layer of the same powder. I pressed the ink into the panel again, and I poured the powder over again and heated it again. This time, I got a rich, limey, sparkly panel that's a perfect addition to my rainbow. Next is blue, and I went back to my ink pads, but this time I'm using them as watercolors. This is another technique I've done before, and I'll link to the video if you're interested in more detailed instructions and several examples. The short version of this technique is that I pressed my inks onto the media mat, spritzed them with water, and then used an almost dry brush to apply them to my Neenah cardstock panel. This paper can't take a lot of water, so it's important to keep the brush quite dry, and that means really streaky results. Now usually we want smooth results, but this time I know these streaks are going to give me loads of texture on this panel. I turned the panel to get kind of crosshatch marks, and I added touches of green and purple, similar to adding different shades to the pink panel earlier. I kept working until I was happy with the coverage. I like having some of the white still showing through, but I definitely wanted this panel to look blue. And next up is gray. Surprise! But don't worry, I have a plan. This time I'm making a big panel, and I'm using my 8x10 gel plate, along with 2 shades of gray ink. But first, I'm going to grab my ink refills and re-ink these ink pads. One thing about making your own cardstock is that you will go through quite a bit of ink, so I definitely recommend having ink refills on hand. To re-ink these ink pads, I press drops of ink all over the surface of the ink pad, and then I gently press it in with an old gift card. If you ever overfill your ink pad, ink blending, direct to paper, and this technique, using the gel plate, are really great ways of taking off the excess ink without wasting it. I pressed my inks all over the plate, and then I used my brayer to spread them out. I like a lot of texture, so I don't worry about getting it smooth. In fact, I'm getting pretty good at leaving rough brayer marks and variations in color. I usually do at least 2 layers of inking before I'm happy with my results. I try to put the colors in different places to add to the texture. Now remember back to the fact that these inks are good for ink blending because they smooth out as they dry. And yes, they do that even when I don't want them to. So I'm really not afraid to leave as much texture as I can get on my panel. Okay, so now what? These panels could be used as backgrounds on cards, but I thought I would use them to remake the cards from last week's cardstock only video to get a comparison between using the 2 types of colored cardstock. So just like last week, I cut some strips with my Essentials by Ellen strip dies. This time I cut 2 sizes of strips. Then I made the cardstock panel on a piece of printer paper, and I remade the cards. I'll link last week's video below if you haven't already seen those details. Last week's cards were crisp and clean, but with small areas of color like this, you can afford to add lots of texture and visual interest. Buying colored cardstock is great, but making your own is a fun alternative. If you want even more ideas, here's a link to another cardstock only video with yet another technique for adding texture and visual interest to a cardstock only card. I'll meet you there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.